Hello, Stan students. Welcome to your Sui Tang Song Dynasties lecture. We are covering key concepts 3.1 and 3.2. We are typically going to be talking about the fragmentation of empires. So after the Han Dynasty, there's a fragmentation in China. And then a unification afterwards, where the Sui dynasty comes along and unifies this area. We'll look at infrastructure projects like the Grand Canal. We'll see what changes in the culture in China. The arts thrive throughout the Song and Tang dynasties. And this is an important era because Buddhism begins to reach China. This map will give you the time periods that we're talking about: the Sui dynasty in the 6th century and the Tang dynasty. So we have about 400 years after the Han dynasty where China is fragmented into what's called the 6 kingdoms, or 6 dynasties. 6 different dynasties that are competing for control in the area at that time. So there's not one unified China in between the Han and Sui dynasties. You can also see on this map, the area in blue is the area of the Grand Canal, which we will cover in depth in class. And this is a period where the Sui dynasty is able to spread further south into China. Something that this allows them to do is they discover champa rice, which is a fast-growing rice, and it brings some of the things that we typically associate with China, mainly rice. Before this, the Chinese people were eating mainly millet as their staple crop, and so something to keep in mind is that this item we associate so closely with China, rice in particular, does not even come along until the 6th century in the Sui dynasty. Alright, so after the collapse of the Han in 221 CE, along comes this era of what I mentioned as the 6 Dynasties period. It is a chaotic time. There's no single stable government. Things are controlled locally. And this is the period when Buddhism begins to make its way into China and becomes more influential. You could say part of the reason for that might be a result of the political chaos at that time. When things are chaotic politically, people tend to find solace in religion, especially if there's something in that religion that accounts for oppression of the weak or women or laborers, which Buddhism gives that to people. It's also adopted as an official religion by a dynasty within the 6 Dynasties period called the Ming Dynasty, but this shouldn't be confused with the later Ming Dynasty that we'll talk about in the next unit. The Sui dynasty begins construction on the Grand Canal. It'll be developed further in the later dynasties, and this is something that will connect the Yellow River in the north to the Yangtze River in the south. It'll be a great way for them to transport goods, to connect the growing cities that are starting to really thrive in these periods, and as I mentioned, you will learn more about those in class. Okay, so the Sui dynasty is able to unify China once again. They reestablish order within China. And this is a period where the arts flourish. An example of this would be shadow puppets or something that come about that are still used today in China, where people will take a transparent screen and put a light behind it and have a puppet show just using shadows. And so this is something that's culturally iconic about China that comes about in this period. Also, as a result of building the Grand Canal, something that the government used was an institution called corvée labor, which was a forced labor system that the state would mandate people to work for no wages, simply as a means of taxation, in a way. So instead of paying tax, the state would mandate that individuals work on the canal. The Sui dynasty is a fairly short-lived dynasty. It really only serves as a means to reunify China before the Tang Dynasty. You might compare them to something like the Qin Dynasty prior to the Han Dynasty. It's a fairly short empire or dynasty that thrives only before an even larger dynasty. And so the dynasty in this case would be the Tang Dynasty. The leaders of the Tang Dynasty had northern origins, much like the subsequent Song Dynasty after that. They reinstate the Confucian civil service exams, something that had kind of been disrupted during the Six Dynasties period. There's new technologies that are developed during this time, and maybe most importantly is that they extend China's borders to affect growing nations that we're going to talk about here soon, places like Korea and Japan. And so these places come under the influence of China. They consider them part of their territory and they pay tribute to them. And tributes are something that we've talked about in previous lectures. And so refer back to those and make sure you understand the difference between paying taxes and paying tributes as they refer to an empire. All right, another system that thrived in the Tang Dynasty was the equal field system, which was a distribution of land to families from wealthy. It was land that was reappropriated from wealthy landholders to common people, to families. You can think of this as in terms of the merit-based system of the civil service exam. It allows people equal opportunity in some sense. Okay, so I mentioned the tributary system. This is a hierarchical system where China viewed other nations like Korea, like Japan, Vietnam, Mongolia, as almost in a Confucian sense, that China was the father and that these are the sons to the greater person, right? And so they expected that these nations follow some Confucian order in that way. And like I mentioned, they did pay tribute to them as well. But all of those nations were supposed to recognize China as the central nation. There's also improvements in technologies in the Tang period. This is where we have the invention of gunpowder in China. The use of the abacus, steel is improved upon. Paper is developed quite a bit earlier, in 107 CE, but it is not used much until the Tang Dynasty, and so it's utilized more in the Tang Dynasty. Block printing was kind of a primitive form of printing. This wasn't the kind of printing that was as sophisticated as the Gutenberg printing press that will happen later on, but it was a way for the Tang Dynasty to make kind of primitive books. Alright, and then I mentioned there was a change in rice cultivation around 800 CE, the development of champa rice, which is quicker growing, it has a faster yield, and the varieties mature quicker, and a result of this is that the population during the Tang dynasties expands quite a bit. And this is where we see the cities within China really begin to explode. An interesting figure in the Tang Dynasty is Empress Wu, who is the only woman to rule in China under her own name. There were other women in China that ruled vicariously or through other emperors, or they were known as regents, but Empress Wu was the only one to do so under her own name. She was previously a concubine and moved her way into a position of power. She begins this conflict, or carries on this conflict between Buddhists and Confucius within China at this time. She herself considered herself to be a reincarnation of the Buddha, and she forms an alliance with Buddhist monks, other Buddhist monks in China. Now, there's a lot of descriptions about what she would do to political opponents during this time, stories about her throwing opponents in vats of boiling water and boiling them alive. But a lot of those descriptions are suspect simply because they come from the Confucian leaders that come in after her. She did reinstate the civil service exam, which seems contradictory, being that the civil service exam is based on Confucian principles, but she does do that. And so the civil service exam that is reinstituted under Empress Wu is something more like the current civil service exam in China. It's used to recruit people, promote people through the ranks, but it was also used to weaken rivals, people that she was able to keep from taking the civil service exam. Another development in the Tang Dynasty is the existence of flying money, or the use of paper money, which leads to a high inflation during the Tang Dynasty. At first it was something that was very beneficial. It was used to enable more commerce, to allow people to trade easier, but quickly the Tang Dynasty printed too much of the money, and it led to high inflation. And this is one of the reasons for the fall of the Tang Dynasty. Alright, another contribution to the collapse of the Tang Dynasty is a rebellion led by An Lushan in 860 CE. This is a man who worked within the government of the Tang Dynasty. He starts something of a rebellion, of a civil war within the empire, and it collapses, and it ends with no successor to the dynasties. And that will lead to what is called the 5 Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms period. Alright, so some developments in the Song Dynasty after that. There's a new policy towards nomadic groups, something of the form of trying to pay mercenaries, nomadic groups to fight other barbarians, other nomadic groups. So that was something that was used in the Song Dynasty. There was greater commerce. Again, we see a rise in the population and a rise in the cities of that time. So there's demographic changes. The population of China goes from 45 million to in the year 600 to 100 million, almost twice as much in the span of about 500 years. Instead of simply relying on millet or chopper rice as a staple, there's a development of cash crops, and trade increases. There are large tax revenues during this time, and as I mentioned, the population of cities grows. About 20% of the population of the total population at that time lived within cities. This may sound like progress, but there's problems that come along with that as well. Problems of disease and widespread famine, those types of things.